My dad, quite a character, a super dynamic person. He was a dad, but he also was a businessman, a little bit of a colored character, a bit shady at times. My mom says that he's the shadiest person that she knew, but also funny and kind and generous. I mean, my dad was a drug dealer, so interesting elements there. He also became a confidential informant, so sort of turned on the people that he used to consider colleagues. There's this interesting story that my mom loves to tell about how he was injured in the factory, but ended up getting like a pretty significant settlement and ended up buying a lot of homes with that money and sort of became like a real estate investor, but also still a drug dealer. On July 11th, 2002, my dad was shot in the doorway of his home in Belmont County, Ohio. The greater circumstances surrounding that morning include a home invasion next door where my dad's family also lived, and these 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 men ended up at my dad's house, shot him in the doorway, and left and have never been caught. On paper seems very quick, very simple. The logistics of that day and the details are much more complicated than that. They did break into the house next door, so the police chalked it up as they were looking for drugs, they were looking for money next door, couldn't find them, ended up at my dad's house, and my dad ended up dead. And that's sort of how it's been treated ever since. Even when you talk to the police now, they say, oh, it was this home invasion gone wrong story. My dad was never the target. It just sort of ended up that way. But that just seems really hard for me to believe. They were next door to my dad's house for 30 to 45 minutes. Not a single person in that house ended up dead. They were at my dad's house for maybe 60 seconds, and my dad ended up dead, and they never even entered the house. Nothing was stolen. It didn't seem like they were going to rob my dad. So just the circumstances surrounding that seem very suspicious for it to be a home invasion gone wrong. I was 6. I mean, I think from like a grander family perspective, it really split us up. From that moment on, I didn't see my sister for 20 years. I never went up to visit. She never came down to visit. We hardly spoke, online. It really sort of tore us all apart. I think from a personal level, I was so young that in the beginning, it didn't feel as monumental as it did the older I got. And I realized there was sort of this piece missing from my family dynamic and lessons I would have learned from a father figure, from a dad. I couldn't shake it after a while of just wondering. I always felt really connected to true crime documentaries and stories, sort of unknowingly involved in one myself. So I think growing up with this like urge to try to solve the documentaries I was watching myself, it felt like a natural progression to then say, I want to take this story into my own hands because no one is doing anything. Is there enough to put this out into the world? Will information come in? I don't really know. But I think my natural curiosity just said it's worth the risk to try to figure out what happened, because I didn't really know what else to do. I'm not a police officer. I'm not a lawyer. I can't really do anything else besides just put out the information. I think it's easy to sort of shrug off people like my dad. And I hope that the way that I tell my story through my perspective as a daughter, it draws people in a way where they feel empathy for my dad, even if they don't necessarily support his lifestyle choices. He didn't deserve to die. And I think that's the biggest takeaway is you can feel invested in stories where maybe you don't necessarily relate to the victim, because nobody deserves this. And we have so much power as fans of true crime to help people, which sort of is the other side of this. I think there's a miss in the true crime genre right now for what people are sort of coining as ethical true crime. And I'm not exactly sure what that looks like or what that means, but I do think a step in the right direction is letting victims and families of victims take ownership of their own story. If a reporter was doing a podcast about my dad, knowing his background, it would not sound the same as it is me telling the story about my dad. He would be painted as just a drug dealer, and that would be it. And you get to see my dad in such a more dynamic light because it's me telling this story. I have some family members, like my sister, who are also just desperate for answers and want me to do whatever it takes to find them. I have other family members who are just not that excited about, the skeletons in our family closet being on such a public scale, which I empathize with, but this is my dad, and I just feel like I have to do whatever it takes to solve this case. And now that I'm sort of seeing the public response, I almost feel a responsibility for the people who, are like me. I mean, my dad's case isn't the only one that's unsolved in a community like this with, a victim like this. And now that I'm hearing more and more stories, I almost feel like a responsibility not only to myself and my dad and my sister, but these other people who don't have answers that deserve them just as much as I do. I am actively taking you on the journey of me investigating this case and hopefully closing it very soon.